I skillfully set up my own talk with my question to Matt, actually, because I am going to talk a little bit about what's obsessing me at the moment, which is, of course, understanding the general election, what that means, the general election just before Christmas, what that means. And I think, like, thinking about consciousness deflation, well, like consciousness inflation and consciousness deflation, they go along together, is a useful way in trying to think about what was going on, what happened in 2019, and therefore what happened in the months before that, and how we get out of it. We could, like, just to gloss it, we could just say, look, the Corbyn project just ran into a form of consciousness deflation that it couldn't overcome, and probably didn't expect, I think. Particularly a form of consciousness deflation specific to a certain subsection of property pensioners, which is basically the bedrock of the new sort of electoral coalition of the right, which is property pensioners in the UK, in the US, across much of Western Europe, and in other countries as well, I think. I say that because I have just written a book, well, I wrote a book, came out last year, called Generation Left, which is trying to think about this huge divide huge political divide amongst generations. There's just a general picture, absolutely visible in the 2017 election here and the 2019 election, of young people voting and moving to the left, older people voting and moving to the right. Something that takes off incredibly quickly. Around about 2016, actually, takes off 2015, 2016 in different countries. But it takes off in different countries at the same time and reaches really dramatic proportions, where you're getting 75% of 18 to 24-year-olds voting for the left or for the Labour Party in the UK, voting for Sanders in the Democratic presidential elections, those sorts of things. At the other end of the scale, over 65, 75% voting for actually Hillary Clinton in the previous one, but the current Democratic race is like completely divided by age. I'm not going to rehearse the argument of the book, but like this is one of the things we've got to sort of get our heads around. That's where Labour lost, and Labour lost in particular around this sort of property pensioners, particularly in the small towns of the Midlands and the North, who were in an alliance with the property pensioners who are much wealthier in the small towns of the South, basically. It's a sort of geographical and an age divide in what happened in politics. The geographical divide actually devolves to a large extent to the age divide, because small towns are much older and young people have moved away from those small towns into the cities. And there's some debate about how strong that is. My argument in the book, I'm going to do a very, very quick version of that, which is, we can start with this idea that like this generational divergence in political beliefs, actions, is rooted in a divergence in material interests between young and old, particularly sparked by 2008, or perhaps crystallized by 2008, we'd say, something like that. So in some ways, that's good news, right? Because if this political phenomena is rooted in material interests, well, those material interests can be reformed or initially reframed in a different way. So you can try to reframe those interests so you split off particular alliance and form new alliances. I think if we... Oh, no, I'll do this bit, actually. That's not a simple thing. Linking material interests to political action is far from simple, right? Obviously. And therefore, trying to reframe material interests in order to change political action and political belief is also incredibly complicated. In the book, I try to make this move where I say, look, material interests only really make sense when they're paired with a vision of the future. Right? Material interests only really make sense when they're linked to a particular sense of what is socially and politically possible, what you think the future might look like. Right? Oh, it'll be in my interest to do this because, look, this is going to happen in the future. Right? And so in my book I say, look, I think there's been a divergence between generations, not just on material interests, but also in a sense of what's socially and politically possible and what an attractive future might look like. What attractive and viable future might look like. I think there's been a diversion of that. I'm not going to do that argument anymore. But look, we can think of it in this way. That the Labour Party manifesto and the election campaign was really premised on trying to make a material offer, right, which would reframe the material interests of propertied pensioners in the North and in the Midlands, reframe that so that they would find an alliance or a commonality, a new common material interest with the more urban populations and these sort of younger urban populations, right? There's like a material, we can reframe your material interests, right? One of those was this proposition for a cap on the amount you would have to pay over a lifetime for social care, and so free elder care, right? One of the reasons why high property prices in particular are incredibly important to older generations, particularly retired generations, is because we have replaced state-based welfare systems with asset-based welfare systems, basically. And so the idea that you could take equity withdrawal out of your home and use that to pay for elder care, it looks like the most secure way to ensure that your care is going to be taken care of in old age, basically. So you can see there's a material offer made there, but what didn't happen or what didn't work was the sense of what is socially and politically possible was not changed to match that material offer, right? Particularly amongst the older populations in those key, sort of electorally key areas. Demographically not that key, but electorally key areas, what's been termed the red wall or whatever. I want to park that problem and come back to it a bit later, because I think the idea of like consciousness inflation and therefore consciousness deflation and the particular forms that might take amongst different generations, it might be key or at least useful in trying to think through that problem and what we might try and do about it. So I want to talk a little bit about Mark Fisher's engagement with like consciousness raising, consciousness inflation, consciousness deflation. You know, it plays a bit of a role in the chapter that he wrote for Acid Communism, the sort of introductory chapter. And he lays more of an... We've only got a few fragments of what we're going to turn into the Acid Communism book from Mark. There's a few talks he did, a few articles he wrote, the course he designed and was running in Goldsmiths, and then this introduction. And it does seem as though this idea of consciousness inflation was one of the prisms through which he was using to look back and reassess what was going on in the 1960s and 1970s, social movements that were going on there. I've probably got a bit of background which is interesting, which might be interesting about like what was in Mark's head when he was writing this, because when Mark was basically Mark was trying to write a book about post-capitalist desire. It didn't have a name, right? When I talked to him about it in 2014, 2015. And at that point, Mark was involved in a political organisation called Plan C, which I'm also involved in. I'm more of a paper member now. And at that time, Plan C had been doing experiments with consciousness raising, trying to reinvent consciousness raising groups for contemporary conditions. Right? And that was the direct inspiration. That's why Mark started to take on this idea of consciousness inflation. He was a member of Plan C, he was involved in those discussions, etc. I don't think he went to one of the groups, but he was involved in that. I mean, one of the inspirations for consciousness raising groups, the most famous, almost paradigmatic sort of example of consciousness raising practices are the consciousness raising groups, which are the organizational bedrock of the second wave feminist movement in the late 19s, well, from 1968 on and through to the 1970s and even to the 1980s as well. They're quite a simple form. They're basically a group of women get together, or sometimes actually mixed groups in the 1970s, get together, meet regularly, and discuss their own lives. They just discuss their own experiences, their own problems, etc. And it seems to work somewhere like this, is that if you get together in a group, you discuss your own problems, what happens is you find out a lot of the problems are common, right? You have common problems, and therefore that leads you quite naturally to try and think, well, look, these problems, the commonality of these problems must imply that they have some sort of structural cause, right? Because they're so common, they can't actually be the fault of some sort of internal failing, which you might well have thought of, that is why that problem occurred beforehand. So that leads you to some sort of trying to position your own experiences within an understanding of the structural forces which condition those experiences. That's basically how consciousness raising groups, and like from there, of course, right, you identify the sort of like the constraining structural problems. You also identify the desires which are being constricted by that. And then that forms the basis from which you can take collective action, right? That's the idea of consciousness raising groups. So that was obviously an inspiration when Plan C was starting to talk about how do we reinvent consciousness-raising practices from contemporary conditions, like in 2014 to 2015. But there was a much more direct inspiration for this discussion, which was an article Plan C published on its website in 2014 called "We're All Very Anxious." Have people come across this article? No one's come across it. Let me rehearse the argument then. Well, I can't rehearse the whole argument, but it's a really interesting. I'd recommend you go and have a little read of it. It's not very long. And the argument is it sort of like starts with this classic periodization of capital, history of capitalism. So the 20th century, we might say, you know, Fordism, post-Fordism, neoliberalism, whatever. And he says, look, with each iteration of capitalism, each iteration of capitalism is accompanied by a dominant reactive affect, right? So a particular reactive affect is dominant and accompanies each iteration of capitalism. So early capitalism is accompanied by the affect of misery. Right? And so the early working class organizations or movements, he says, the Institute for Precarious Consciousness, which is one guy in Nottingham, wrote "We Are All Very Anxious." He says, look, you know, we can understand the early working class organizations, the development of the working class movement as the development of machines to fight misery, he says. They succeeded to some degree, right? They succeeded to some degree. What we have in like the post-war period, or perhaps what we might call a Fordist period, the period of dominated by Fordist work, we say the dominant reactive affect is boredom. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the repertoire of the movements of that time, what the movements of that time were doing was to construct machines for fighting boredom. The argument then goes, the dominant reactive affect now is anxiety, right? And in fact, we're still a little bit attached to these repertoires for fighting boredom, and they're not very good when the dominant affect is anxiety. So, he says, at the end of this article, right, perhaps the precondition for all forms of acting, for the ability to act, is to reinvent consciousness-raising practices based around as machines for fighting anxiety. And that is like the precondition, perhaps, for being able to do other forms of action, right? That was the specific inspiration for Plan C to sort of think, let's reinvent consciousness-raising practices as machines for fighting anxiety. And this is what was feeding into and why Mark picked up consciousness inflation. See, Mark died in 2017, and lots of people in Plan C were very upset about that, myself included. And so we took this decision to sort of like, let's try and embed Mark's ideas within the practices of the organisation. How do you do that? Yeah, complicated task. One of the things that came out of that was me and a friend, comrade Nadia Idle, developed this sort of workshop. We called it the Building Acid Communist Consciousness Raising Workshop. And we sort of just, it was a bit of an experiment. And we did these workshops. We've done them in, you know, around the UK, in Germany, actually. And other groups have picked up the model and tried to run it in different places. And you know, it's a very simple thing. It's sort of like perhaps a 2-3 hour workshop in which, you know, perhaps we'd get like 30, 40 people there. We'd split them into groups of like 7 or 8, and then we'd put a series of questions to them, and we would discuss them in the groups and then feed back into and we'll have a big discussion on a sort of like plenary level. And the questions are things such as, like, you know, when was the last time you felt truly free from work? Or when was the last time you were bored and what did it feel like? People, you know, discuss these and feedback. Then towards the end of the workshop, we do this sort of reveal moment and we say, look, all of the questions we were asking you were where we think people looked, or the constraints perhaps on post-capitalist desire in the 1970s, like boredom, the great spur for punk rock, etc. You know, the revolt against work, you know, we know where freedom begins. It begins when work ends. None of that works as well now, and that's what comes out in the discussion. So then we say, what sorts of questions should we have asked if we want to work out where post-capitalist desire is being created now? That's the format of the workshop. They were very surprising to me. People seem to find them quite powerful experiences, mainly because we don't really get a chance to talk about like our own experiences with a spur, collectively with a spur to think about them in terms of like the structural constraints on those experiences. But we've reached a limit. We've quite quickly reached a limit of their usefulness and they needed to be reinvented in some way. Let me just read a little snippet from, I went back and read a whole series of blog posts from the K-Punk blog from this time, from 2015, they're in the K-Punk book, and there was a little snippet when Mark is thinking about consciousness raising, from this, it's a little blog post called Abandon Hope, Summer is Coming. Mark had a real productive moment in 2015 when he started to write about this stuff. He says, the roots of any successful struggle will come from people sharing their feelings, especially their feelings of misery and desperation, and together attributing the source of those feelings to impersonal structures, albeit impersonal structures mediated by particular figures to which we must attach populist loathing. I'll sign up to that. So that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to get people to talk about their own experience and think about the impersonal structural forces which condition those experiences. The problem with that is, I don't think you can get to a good understanding of the impersonal structures that are conditioning your experience just by sitting down and discussing your own experience, right? In fact, Fredric Jameson talks about this when he talks about cognitive mapping, right? He says, look, this is this real big problem. Let me just do cognitive mapping quickly. So basically, Jameson takes this idea from a guy called Kevin Lynch, who's talking about how do we walk around a city. We basically, we never have the totality of the city in our head. Well, nowadays we just use our phones, obviously, but when he was talking about that, it was like we navigate around our system because we have a cognitive map of that city within our heads, which is made up of landmarks and habitual routes, right? And so we may not take the most efficient route because we've got a cognitive map. He says, well, we can do that on the systemic level of global capital. He says, basically what we have is a very impoverished cognitive map of how the world works. And he says, basically he says, in the very early days of capitalism, you could get a pretty good cognitive map of the way that the system worked just by your own everyday personal experiences, right? Because, hey, look over there, there's a guy wearing a top hat, he's the factory owner, great. That breaks down through things such as imperialism, right? And where your own preconditions of your own life now depend on stuff which is going in the sphere in which you don't have access to, right? So you need to build up a cognitive map through other ways, right? So Jason Moore has this thing about behind Manchester lies Mississippi, right? Engels was studying the factories in Manchester, but those could not take place without what was going on in Mississippi, which is slavery. Actually, the mill workers of Manchester managed to make that cognitive map because they went on strike and organised to support the abolition of slavery during the American Civil War. Anyway, I'm getting beyond myself. Obviously now we have a much more difficult problem, which is, we have things such as the complexities of capitalism operating on a global level, the complexities added through temporal displacement through finance, etc. But we can also take this back to this idea of social reproduction, actually, right? So social reproduction is all of that work that takes place, which is usually obscured, but is actually the premise from which everyday life takes place, right? Seeing as I've only got a little bit of time left. Okay, look, one of the ways we can do that, right, we can think about that is, what do we do about this cognitive mapping? One of the ways we can do that is that we use struggles as sort of landmarking. We use struggles in order to create new landmarks which are sort of like pedagogical, indicate how the system works. In fact, Hart and Negri just did a reflection on empire 20 years on from empire, and they did a look back at the anti-globalization movement, and that's what they were more or less saying this argument, saying the anti-globalization movement, for all of its faults, it was incredibly useful for landmarking, for making visible certain processes which were previously obscured. Let's return to the red wall. In fact, before that, I'll say, so this idea of consciousness raising as a machine for fighting anxiety, I start to think perhaps that's also linked to a particular cohort. Perhaps the examples of anxiety, and anxiety as a dominant affect, is linked to young people, and older people have got something else going on, right? The older people, particularly in the red wall, they're subject to they've been subject to 40 years of consciousness deflation, total grinding down of the space of possibility, a complete collapse in the idea that collective action and politics can improve life, right? Which is why, if you think about, one of the things you have to understand is, why are older people acting in a way which fucks younger people, right? And if you don't believe that systemic change is possible, then acting to protect your own inheritance, to protect property prices, can be a reasonable way to address the interests of your younger siblings, who they no doubt love, right? Even if, in the meantime, in the immediate sphere, they are fucking the interests of their younger siblings. What was I going to do about it? So what do we do about it? Well, one of the things we need to do is to try and have a new narrative in which to help people make sense of their lives, or older people make sense of their lives in a new way. It's something to do with legacy, right? Like we could look at climate change, right? Why are there instances of climate denial much higher amongst older populations than younger populations? If we live on the brink of catastrophic climate collapse, what is the legacy of the baby boomer generation? That legacy is, you've led us to a world historic crisis, right? Are the conditions of young people, are they really parlous and in a terrible state, or are they not? If not, then you young people are just whinging snowflakes, right? Who just can't face up to the world. If so, well, all of that growth that happened in the 1990s is illusory. All of the wealth in which I built up is no longer the result of my personal character. It's just a historical fluke that we happened to, we were given access to property at a particular time when property prices went up. Okay, I've got a little bit more. I've got a little bit more to do. Basically, so one of the things is I'm trying to understand anti-woke discourse as like a machine for fighting consciousness raising, right? Because anti-woke discourse is a machine for saying, for refusing to acknowledge the preconditions for my own life, right? So what goes along with that is a particular note. I think the libidinal link, the libidinal anchor for contemporary right-wing politics is a particular concept of freedom or autonomy, right? Which gets undermined if you recognize that your sense of autonomy relies on social reproductive work, relies on offloading costs onto other people, offloading costs onto the Earth system processes upon which continued civilization takes place, right? That's the libidinal link. So the classic idea is like the sort of like Randian CEO who said, whose freedom of action, he cannot see his freedom of action is based on the fact that somebody's doing his dishes for him, basically. So he doesn't have to do all of that stuff. Do you know what I mean? I think that's a libidinal link. How do we break that? I mean, the only way you can do it is you need a narrative to make sense of the last 40 years. So we can't have an anti-austerity analysis because the consciousness deflation amongst older generations in the Red War went back a lot further. But the only other way you can address that is to show that collective political action, the only way to reinflate consciousness and reinflate a sense of possibility is to show that collective political action is a viable way of addressing your material needs. And that may well start in those red wall areas with very small projects of autonomous social reproduction, etc., solidarity projects, etc., something like that.